Okay, Joel, so here's a basic rundown on the synoptic problem for you. First of all, we got Mark Goodacre, who says that the synoptic problem is the greatest literary enigma of all time. Now, to kick you off, the first real theory about the synoptic problem was posed by our man Augustus of Hippo, and this is the general theory of Matthew and priority, which was the idea that Matthew was the first gospel writer. Now, this is an idea that was supported by early church writings and what the early church thought the order of the gospels was, and essentially Augustinian hypothesis follows that Matthew wrote his gospel, then Mark wrote his gospel, and then Luke wrote his gospel. Now, the general idea of the synoptics via this proposition is that Matthew wrote his gospel, Mark wrote his gospel using Matthew, and then Luke used both Matthew and Mark to write his gospel. For the general overview, the synoptic problem is the issue of three gospels intrinsically linked but fundamentally different, for those of you all who need that, but you really shouldn't. So this was supported by the belief. Unfortunately, while we would return to Matthew and priority later, Mark and priority began to be the overruling idea that pervaded church theology and theory. And Mark and priority was originally proposed by Gottlob Christian Storr. Now, Gottlob Christian Storr was an interesting man with an interesting name, and he proposed it first, but nobody liked his ideas because they were shit. And it wasn't until later with Karl Lockman, who originally compared the all three synoptic gospels, that people started to take more notice of Mark and priority. What Karl Lockman found is that in terms of chronology in the gospels, while Matthew and Mark often agreed against Luke, and Luke and Mark often agreed against Matthew, Matthew and Luke didn't often agree against Mark, or didn't ever agree against Mark. Now, what this seems to suggest is that in terms of chronology and order of events, Mark had the most reliable account. And it came down to a couple of other dudes, Christian Wise and Christian Wilk, who pointed to Karl Lockman's theories as not only suggesting that Mark had the most reliable chronology, but also that made Mark's gospel the first gospel ever written. This, however, created a problem because there was a certain amount of information Matthew and Luke had that Mark did not have, and church scholars now had to account for this missing information that was not in Mark. So, to do this, they devised of a Q source. Now, this source is a theoretical amount of speeches or sayings said by Jesus, and it is where these scholars say we draw a large amount of our passages in Luke and Matthew that are not in Mark. Now, scholars are responsible for this are Barclay and B.H. Streeter, who gives us the most widely recognized theory of Q source that we have today. Now, a good example of a place where Mark skips over that may have been included in Q sources, for example, the Sermon of the Mount or the Sermon on the Plain, which are both clearly paraphrases of the same account that Matthew and Luke have both chosen to include, but Mark has for some reason omitted. Now, the two-source theory can be expanded into a four-source theory when we have to take into account the passages that Luke has that are not in either Mark or Matthew, or the passages Matthew has that are not in either Mark or Luke. This four-source theory suggests that both Luke and Matthew have their own sources independent of each other and of Mark, and this creates four sources, those being independent source number 1 for Luke, independent source number 2 for Matthew, Q source, and Mark. However, there are some rivaling theories arising around two-source theory. Though two-source theory was widely accepted and almost fact in the in about the 20th century, there have been some rising theories which are attempting to challenge this. The two main ones being Farah theory and Grieshbach theory, I think. Yes, Grieshbach theory, or the Grieshbach hypothesis. Now, Farah theory still follows that Mark was the first gospel writer, but says that it's actually pretty reasonable to assume that Luke could have read Matthew's gospel. Farah says that while Mark did write the first gospel, Matthew wrote the second using Mark, and Luke wrote the third using both Matthew and Mark. Now, Farah states that a Q source is irrelevant, and had Luke had the ability to read Matthew's gospel, then that would solve all of the issues and answer all the questions that Q source brought with it. This Farah thought that this was a more elegant solution, and he said it does. And Farah stated that this theory does not. Farah thought that this was more simpler, more elegant, and was supported by sections of Matthew and Luke that agree upon changes made to Mark. So Farah said that because there are some places in Matthew and Luke where there's similar accounts, but they have been changed, and Matthew and Luke agree, but Mark don't. Had Matthew and Luke both used the same sources, Q and Mark, they would probably not agree on changes, or would agree with Mark on these changes that have been made. However, the leading theory is what's known as the Grieshbach theory, or how it's known in its modern form, the two Gospels theory. Now, this is the idea that there is no Mark in priority, and instead we revert to Matthew in priority, as we have not done for a while. And it goes Matthew, then Luke, using Matthew, writes his Gospel, then Mark, using both Luke and Matthew, writes his Gospel. Now, the idea of this being that instead of a Matthew and Luke, which elaborate on the ideas of Mark, we have a Mark, which is essentially a simplified and perhaps watered down version of events that happen in Matthew and Luke. Now, the general chronology for this happening is that in the world of the early church, the biggest conflict happening within the Christian community was the differences between both Jewish and Christian authority and Jewish and Christian teaching. Matthew, therefore, felt the need to write his gospel to unify these two cultures and show that Jesus was in fact the fulfillment of Old Testament and Old Scripture. And this explains the huge amount of Jewish historical and biblical references in Matthew's gospel. However, after Christian persecution became extremely widespread after the martyrdom of Stephen, Christians expanded into larger areas of Greek states and Gentile communities. Paul, now being a part of this expansion, having converted, saw a need for a more Gentile gospel, and therefore required Luke, his companion, to write a new gospel. While this is the case, Paul wanted to ensure that this gospel was accurate, himself and Luke not being direct witnesses to the testimony, the ministry of Jesus Christ. So he asked for confirmation from Peter that his gospel was correct. Now, Peter agreed that confirmation was valid and supplied confirmation in a series of speeches which he delivered most probably to Roman centurions in Rome. Now, these speeches are what we believe formed the basis for Mark's gospel. Essentially what happened is that Peter, knowing very well the gospel of Matthew already, and using information he'd gathered from the new gospel of Luke, would have delivered these speeches in a more simplified, more emotional, more invested manner, and a manner which is slightly less eloquent, because instead of being written out, it is delivered vocally to a crowd. That these speeches would have been delivered to Roman centurions in order to both just convert them to Christianity, and also to just supply evidence that the Gospel of Luke is in fact backed by people who witnessed the events themselves. However, when the centurions themselves heard these speeches, they wanted actual copies of these speeches written down, which is where they approached Peter's protege, Mark. Mark is responsible for recording and writing down Peter's speeches, and these it is stated in early church writings that 50 copies of these speeches were made and were delivered to all the centurions. These entered circulation and became the Gospel of Mark as we know it. Now, this actually entered circulation before the Gospel of Luke, which is why authorship of the Gospel of Mark happens first, but Luke is used as a source for Mark. This explains the briefness of Mark being in speeches. It explains the emotionness. It explains the present tense that Mark is delivered in when it is in an original translation. Of course, when we read the modern translations, it's in past tense as it has been moved to that to make more sense. But in the original translation, Mark is the only gospel which is written in the present tense, deriving a more personal retelling of the story as we would receive from Peter. The Greaseback theory is also very prominent because it does not rely on internal evidence like the two-source theory does. What this means is that while the two-gospel theory can say we're supported by church writings, early church fathers, we are supported by evidence we can find within the Gospels, and we are supported by historical knowledge we have, the two-source theory is only, because it rejects church writings, is only supported by actual literary evidence that can be found in the Gospels, which makes it slightly weaker in parts. William Farmer is the one responsible for presenting the modern version of the two-gospel theory as we now know it, and has basically made that the leading competitor with two-source theory as we know it today. Other than that, the important thing to note is that the Greaseback theory, while originally proposed by Johann Greaseback, was not as prominent and not as well developed as the modern two gospels theory, and it was actually developed in a very early stage in like the something like the 18th, 19th century. However, didn't receive prominence until William Farmer revamped it and revealed it to a modern scholarly audience. So essentially, that's the synoptic problem in a nutshell. You've got the Augustinian hypothesis, you've got the two-source or four-source hypothesis, you've got the Farrer theory, and you have the Greaseback hypothesis, also known as the two Gospels hypothesis. That's your rundown on the synoptic problem. There you go, Joel. Have a nice day. Boom.